You've been working harder than ever. But here's the part they'll never say out loud. Your paycheck has been shrinking for 50 years. In the 1950s, one salary built a house, raised a family, secured a future. Today, you work twice as much and can barely keep up. This wasn't an accident. It was a design, a system that takes more from you while making you believe you're winning. And when you see how they pulled this off, you'll realize the illusion isn't broken. It's still working, exactly as they planned. There was a time when the system seemed to work. From the early 1950s to the late 1960s, a single paycheck could do what now seems impossible. It bought a house, paid for a car, covered healthcare, education, and still left room for savings. The American worker wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Factories roared day and night. Industries like steel, automobiles, and manufacturing were at their peak. The United States had emerged from World War II as an economic superpower, and ordinary families felt the impact directly. Real wages, wages adjusted for inflation, grew almost in perfect sync with productivity. When workers produced more, they earned more. The numbers from that era tell a clear story. Productivity doubled between 1947 and 1973, and wages doubled with it. The prosperity wasn't just for executives, it flowed to the shop floor, to teachers, to office clerks. The middle class grew so fast, it became the defining feature of American society. People believed in the promise because they lived it every day. Unions played a key role. They were strong, negotiating for better pay, safer working conditions, and pensions that guaranteed security in old age. Employers competed for talent by offering benefits instead of cutting costs. The relationship between labor and capital, while far from perfect, was at least balanced enough to sustain the dream. Everywhere you looked, there were signs of progress. Suburbs expanded, filled with families who owned their homes outright. College education became accessible to millions, paving the way for upward mobility. A single income was enough to live, and in many cases to prosper. But beneath the optimism, something else was happening, something most didn't see. Corporations were growing, merging, and quietly expanding their influence over government policies. The seeds of deregulation and a new economic philosophy were being planted. The rules of the game were about to change, but no one was watching the rule book. Why would they? Life was good. The charts went up. The paycheck matched the effort. The dream felt real because for a brief window in history, it was. Yet power rarely stays balanced for long. As corporations grew more powerful, so did their appetite. They saw labor not as a partner, but as a cost to be reduced. They pushed for policies that favored profit over wages, efficiency over people. They lobbied quietly, reshaping the landscape to prepare for a future where growth would no longer be shared. By the early 1970s, the first cracks appeared. Productivity continued to rise, but wages stopped. The two lines that had climbed together for decades began to separate. At first, the gap was small, almost invisible to the average worker, but over time, it widened into a chasm. You see, the break didn't come with an announcement. There was no headline saying, "The dream is over." Instead, the shift was gradual, almost elegant in its execution. Workers kept working, the economy kept growing, but the rewards no longer reached the hands that built the wealth. While families believed they were still climbing, the system had quietly changed. The extra value they created was no longer returning to them. It was being siphoned upward, concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. This wasn't a natural accident. It was the result of decisions made behind closed doors by those who stood to gain the most. Tax policies began to favor capital over labor. The power of unions was slowly eroded through legislation and corporate tactics. The financial system was rewired to extract more from the bottom while enriching the top. And yet people didn't see it. They were too busy working, raising families, chasing the dream. They didn't notice the moment when the rules turned against them because it happened so quietly. That's how illusions work. They don't break suddenly. They fade slowly until one day you wake up and realize everything has changed. The promise that once felt inevitable had been replaced by a new reality. You could work twice as hard and still fall behind. The ladder was still there, but the rungs were getting further apart. For decades, you were told that hard work equals success. But what happens when the system stops rewarding hard work? Who benefits from your effort when your paycheck stays the same and theirs grows endlessly? You've seen the first cracks in their story. If you want this investigation to keep cutting deeper, leave your mark, hit like, and let them know the illusion is failing. Because the question isn't just why wages stopped rising, it's who decided they should stop and how they kept you from noticing. The golden era didn't end with a crash. It ended with a whisper. By the early 1970s, something fundamental shifted in the American economy. Productivity, the measure of how much value workers created, kept soaring, but wages stopped moving. The two lines that had risen together for decades began to split apart. At first, it was barely noticeable, but year after year, the gap widened until it became a canyon. The reasons were buried under layers of complexity, but they were no accident. Policies changed. Deregulation swept through industries. The oil crisis shook the global economy, giving corporations the perfect excuse to restructure. Globalization sent jobs overseas, chasing cheaper labor. While these factors were presented as necessary adjustments, they all pointed in one direction. Workers got less, corporations kept more. You can see it in the numbers. From 1973 onward, productivity in the United States more than doubled. Real wages? They stayed almost flat. The value workers created went somewhere, but not into their pockets. The system was shifting, and it was deliberate. Corporate leaders embraced a new philosophy: maximize shareholder value at all costs. Wages were no longer seen as investments in people. They were costs to be minimized. Union power, once a shield for the middle class, was systematically dismantled. The bargaining power of workers eroded until it barely existed. But here's the brilliance of the trick. While your pay stalled, they made sure you didn't feel poorer, at least not right away. They replaced wage growth with something else: credit. The 1980s brought an explosion of easy money. Credit cards, home equity loans, personal lines of credit. Suddenly, you could buy the life your stagnant paycheck couldn't cover. It felt like prosperity, but it was a trap. At the same time, propaganda did its work. Commercials, TV shows, and glossy ads told you that success was still within reach. They sold the image of upward mobility while hiding the truth. You weren't moving up. You were sinking into debt. And while you borrowed, they built empires. Corporate profits surged, executive pay skyrocketed, stock markets soared. The very gap you couldn't see was funding the luxury of the few. This wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system, a machine that kept you chasing while quietly transferring your labor's value to those at the top. By the 1990s, the break was no longer silent. You could feel it. Families needed two incomes to afford what one paycheck once covered. Debt became a way of life. The illusion of prosperity was maintained only through borrowing against the future. And yet, the narrative stayed the same. Work harder, believe in the dream, consume more. No one told you that the game had been rewritten and the rules no longer worked in your favor. The silent break of the 1970s wasn't just an economic event. It was the start of a new era, one where the dream was still marketed, but the wealth it promised was already gone. You've just seen how the promise was broken in plain sight. If you're ready to uncover what they've worked hardest to hide, step inside, subscribe, and stay with us, because what comes next will reveal the mask they placed over this collapse. A mask so convincing it made you believe you were winning, even as the ground beneath you disappeared. After the break, the system faced a question. How do you keep workers from noticing they're falling behind? The answer was as elegant as it was dangerous. You don't let them feel it. They needed a cover, something strong enough to hide the stagnation of wages while selling the idea that progress continued. That cover was consumption. From the late 1970s onward, the economy entered a new phase. Instead of earning more, workers were encouraged to spend more, not with the money they had, but with the money they didn't. The credit boom of the 1980s was no coincidence. Banks unleashed credit cards on the masses, home equity loans became a norm, and personal credit lines expanded overnight. Suddenly, families could afford lifestyles far beyond what their paychecks justified. It felt like prosperity. Bigger houses, newer cars, electronics that seemed futuristic, the latest clothes, the next vacation. The narrative was simple. You deserved it, and you could have it. Today, pay later. Advertising amplified the illusion. Commercials portrayed a life where happiness was just one purchase away. TV shows normalized consumption as a measure of success. Hollywood celebrated characters who made it by spending lavishly, not saving wisely. The message was subtle but relentless. Your worth is what you own. But this wasn't only a cultural shift, it was a strategic redesign. Debt became the invisible leash. Every swipe of a credit card, every signed loan agreement tightened control. It kept workers tethered to the system not through loyalty or hope, but through obligation. You didn't question the system when you owed it everything. Behind the glossy images, the numbers told a different story. Household debt began climbing at an unprecedented pace. Mortgages, car loans, student debt all surged. At the same time, the cost of essentials, housing, healthcare, education rose far faster than wages. The paycheck remained frozen, but the spending never stopped because credit filled the gap. Corporations and banks profited twice, first by paying workers less, then by charging them interest to maintain the illusion of a rising lifestyle. It was wealth extraction disguised as opportunity. By the 1990s, the mask was everywhere. Families no longer questioned why they needed two incomes to afford what one paycheck had once covered. They didn't ask why debt was ballooning while salaries stayed flat. They simply adapted. The illusion was so complete, it became normal. And yet cracks began to form. The more the system relied on debt, the more fragile it became. Financial institutions packaged risky loans into complex securities, hiding the instability from the public and from themselves. Every layer of complexity was another layer of disguise, keeping the truth buried. Even as the foundations weakened, the narrative remained. Keep spending, keep believing, the dream is alive. But the reality was rotting from the inside. Then came the late 1990s and early 2000s. Housing prices soared, credit expanded even further, and Wall Street celebrated as if nothing could go wrong. But the numbers were unsustainable. Debt had reached levels never seen before, and the system was balancing on a knife's edge. The mask of prosperity wasn't just a lie, it was a ticking bomb. And when it slipped, the world would finally see how fragile the dream had become. Because what happened next didn't simply reveal the illusion, It shuttered it.
For decades, the house was the ultimate symbol of the American dream. A roof you owned, a lawn you mowed, a deed with your name on it. In the 1950s, that dream was real. 2 average salaries could buy a home, often with room to spare. Ownership wasn't a privilege, it was an expectation. But over time, the house stopped being a home. It became something else, an asset, and assets attract predators. As wages stagnated and costs rose, real estate became the last hope for families to build wealth. Buying a home was no longer just about shelter. It became a desperate attempt to secure stability in a system that was quietly tilting against them. Banks and developers exploited this need, transforming housing into a market of speculation. Prices rose far beyond incomes, but easy credit made the dream seem attainable, on paper. In the 1990s, a new breed of financial innovation took over. Subprime loans, adjustable-rate mortgages, zero-down financing, tools that expanded access while loading borrowers with risk. To the public, they looked like opportunities. To the institutions, they were profit engines. Millions signed contracts they didn't fully understand because the system told them it was safe. Why doubt it? For decades, home ownership had been sold as the safest investment a family could make. Behind the scenes, the stakes were higher than anyone imagined. Banks weren't just lending. They were bundling risky mortgages into complex securities, selling them as safe bets across the globe. Ratings agencies stamped them AAA. Investors poured in. The housing market had become a casino, and families were the chips. By the early 2000s, the game was spiraling. Entire neighborhoods were built not because families needed homes, but because investors demanded returns. Houses became data points, bundled and traded without regard for the people living inside. The market wasn't about homes anymore. It was about speculation. And when speculation drives the dream turns toxic. Then came 2008. The bubble burst. Overnight, millions lost their homes. Streets emptied, neighborhoods decayed, and decades of savings evaporated. The house, their strongest asset, had become the very thing that destroyed them. While families packed boxes, the institutions responsible were rescued. Banks were bailed out. Executives pocketed bonuses. Ordinary people were left with foreclosure notices, debt, and a shattered belief in the promise they had been sold. Home ownership never truly recovered. Prices fell briefly, but wages stayed flat. When the market stabilized, it wasn't rebuilt for families, it was rebuilt for investors. Hedge funds and private equity firms began buying entire blocks in cash, outbidding regular buyers. Homes once tied to independence became corporate rentals. The system flipped. Individuals no longer owned the dream, they rented it back from those who had taken it. Today, millennials and Gen Z face barriers their parents never imagined. Housing prices soar beyond reach, interest rates punish buyers, and stagnant wages stretch saving for a down payment into decades. The house, once the foundation of security, is now a gatekeeping symbol of exclusion. Yet the narrative hasn't changed. Politicians, banks, and media still chant the same line: work hard, save, buy a house. But the numbers tell a different story. For most, the dream is gone. For many, it never existed. The house didn't just break in 2008. It broke long before, when it stopped being a home and became a commodity. Now the question is not why owning a house is so hard. It's who still profits from the dream they told you to chase. Because while you struggle to open the door, someone else already holds the keys. The American dream promised freedom through work, stability through ownership, and wealth through effort. But piece by piece, you've seen how that promise was dismantled. The wages froze, the screens lied, the debt piled up, and the house, the ultimate prize, was turned into a tool of control. The dream they sold wasn't built to last. It was built to keep you chasing. And for decades, it worked. Now the cracks are no longer hidden. The illusion is breaking, and more people are waking up to a truth that was never meant to be seen. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. So the question becomes, what happens when you stop playing by the rules they wrote? What happens when the truth spreads further than they can contain? If this investigation opened your eyes, leave your mark. Hit like so this truth cuts through the noise. And subscribe, not to follow, but to step inside the circle where the next revelations wait. Because the next secrets we uncover will take you even deeper into the machinery they never wanted exposed.